Jobs gone wrong, backwater planets, superstitious locals, nefarious officers, picking up strays, hidden treasure, gunslingers, killer robots, and not your standard issue B1s. No, we're not talking about the next season of The Mandalorian. Welcome to the Han Solo Adventures. And welcome to the Legends Department. My name is Rin, researcher and guide here at the New Republic Centralized Archives on Coruscant. If you listened to the last episode about Splinter of the Mind's Eye, you know that Han Solo did not appear in that novel. We had two brief, kind of vague references to him, and that was it. Well, fast forward a year, and everything is about to change. It's 1979, and the next Star Wars Expanded Universe novel arrives. If you have any doubts about its main character, he's right there in the title. Han Solo at Star's End. Moreover, this was the first in a trilogy. Han Solo at Star's End was followed a few months later by Han Solo's Revenge, and then Han Solo and the Lost Legacy in 1980. We are really making up for lost time. All three stories were written by Brian Daley. Mr. Daley was already published with Del Rey, which handled Star Wars tie-in novels at this point. And he didn't have a particularly long bibliography, having just finished his second science fantasy novel when his publisher gave him the opportunity to write for Star Wars as a change of pace. For the last 30 years or so, these three relatively short novels have been published together as an omnibus, known collectively as the Han Solo Adventures. Unlike Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was intended as a sequel to Star Wars, the Han Solo Adventures are prequels. They take place about a year or two prior to when we catch up with Han and Chewbacca looking for work in the Mos Eisley Cantina. Because of that, there's no sign of Luke or Leia or any other identifiable character for that matter. I mean, that makes sense, but there is another major element missing that might raise a few more questions. The Empire. This was a publishing restriction placed on the author. Lucasfilm wanted to make sure that the Empire developed in the movies, not the tie-in novels. Remember, at this point, we just have Star Wars. Empire Strikes Back is still a few years off. In universe, what we're told is that Han and Chewie were looking for, shall we say, more flexible business opportunities. That means we're heading to the Outer Rim. There we find the corporate sector, governed by its own capital A authority. The Empire pretty much leaves them alone, making the corporate sector a self-contained, corporatocracy, I suppose, with its own paramilitary security force, massive fleet of ships, and corrupt upper crust ruling with an iron fist over a massive swath of the galaxy. Basically, it's the Empire if the Empire's major concern was its profit margins. There's also the Tion hegemony that crops up in the last story, but there's really nothing to say about them. They're pretty much just a name. It's against this background that Han and Chewie hire out their services with the Millennium Falcon and have some adventures. Therein lies the tricky part when we talk about these novels as a collection. Rather than a story that builds and plays out over the course of 3 books, like we might expect with later Legends trilogies, the Han Solo Adventures are exactly that, adventures. Yes, they're sequential, and yes, they take place in a limited time frame, and sure, there are a few characters that carry over from story to story. But they're essentially standalone episodes. They also stick very closely to a set formula. That formula is as follows. The first few chapters will show Han and Chewbacca in the middle of a job. Han's actions here will reveal a little of that heart of gold hiding under the roguish exterior. Something will go wrong, and we will find out what practical thing Han needs or wants for this particular story. This will tumble into Han needing to do the job, even though he isn't entirely sold on it. About this time, Han will meet the girl. She'll be feisty and make it clear that she has no time for his nonsense, but there's a little spark there. We'll probably also acquire the alien sidekick around this time. Their unique abilities will be useful at some point later on. The job will go south and need to be resolved by a combination of scheming, single combat, and all-out battle that Han will take the lead in. There will be daring escapes and probably a little bit of chicanery as well. Han will save the day with his ingenuity, although he likely has a little bit of assistance from this pair of droids that he's acquired, and things will end looking up one way or the other. The girl's willing to give Han a goodbye kiss, and that's it. End scene 3 times over. The job changes. In Star's End, it's an extraction mission that turns into a rescue that turns into a prison break. In Han Solo's Revenge, it's teaming up temporarily with the Authority to expose a slavery ring. And the Lost Legacy? That's just a good old-fashioned treasure hunt. The girls and the alien sidekicks also change from story to story with varying degrees of interest and success. But Han, and to a lesser extent Chewbacca, are always the stars. The other consistent characters are the aforementioned pair of droids, the ancient Bullocks and the tiny ultra-processor Blue Max. They stick around for the entire trilogy, so we'll be talking about them again later on. Of course, formula does not mean carbon copy. As I was reviewing some pertinent points for this episode, I found myself thinking of each story as having a slightly different technical focus, although I use all of those words quite lightly here. Star's End seems most concerned with character, specifically fleshing out Han's. Han Solo's Revenge shifted a little bit towards the plot, and then The Lost Legacy rounded things out by spending a little additional time on its setting. As a consequence, those are things I'll be revisiting when we look at the individual stories. Something you may notice about this episode is that I don't have much in the way of criticism. It's not because the Han Solo trilogy is some triumph of literature. Rather, it's because its weaknesses, and there are weaknesses, are very much the province of the genre. The Han Solo adventures are almost entirely cut from the fabric of pulp fiction. Every story is a series of high-stakes events that would be perfectly at home in a Golden Age sci-fi serial. That's neither good nor bad. Star Wars at its core claims these kinds of stories as an inspiration, but the Han Solo Adventures just dials it up to 11. Having said that, am I going to complain that the dialogue is more snappy than witty, or that the interpersonal relationships lack a little bit of nuance, or that what depth there is, we get by way of somewhat heavy-handed exposition? Well, no, not really, because in the final analysis, we're working within the genre. I hope I can bring out some of the positive points of that as we go on, but it's good to know what you're getting into here. Anyway, let's try to bring some order to the chaos and discuss some of those highlights from each story. But before that, this is your warning that this episode will contain spoilers. In this case, just for the Han Solo adventures. Proceed with caution. The unfamiliar constellations here were how many light years from the planet of Han's birth? He couldn't even make a close guess. Being a smuggler and a flyer for hire had its dangers, and those he accepted with a philosophical shrug. But a run into a prohibited sector with a cargo that would earn him a summary execution if caught? Those were different table stakes altogether. Okay, so those are not the opening words to Han Solo at Star's End, but they serve as well as any to introduce the man of the hour. To strip this story down to absolute basics, Han decides after a run-in with an Authority warship that he needs a waiver, essentially a permit that allows him to do business in the corporate sector, and gives him an excuse for the Millennium Falcon's, shall we say, interesting technical specifications. There is no way for him to acquire this kind of document legally, but Han and Chewie happen to have an old friend that they can call on, Doc. The story calls Doc and his men outlaw techs, which I suppose is a somewhat evocative title if rather vague. Basically, if you need an extra legal upgrade to your ship, to your droids, or to your records, Doc's your man. Doc, unfortunately, is missing. So enter the girl, Doc's daughter Jessa, who's holding down the fort in her father's absence. She clearly has some kind of history with Han, I am a nice man Solo, but is willing to do the needed repairs to the Falcon and arrange for the waiver if Han will take the job, extracting an operative from an Authority data center. Han doesn't like this, but since the situation is desperate, he agrees. At this point, we meet our droid duo. First, there's the lumbering, almost 100-year-old Bullocks. He has a special modification that allows another droid, the tiny, brand-new, high-powered Blue Max, to come along for the ride in his chest cavity. Now, Blue Max is central to the job. Whoever this is that Han is going to pick up needs to be able to trawl and collect data very deeply and very quickly, and you just need to plug Blue Max in and he'll take care of that for you. So off Han and Chewie and the droids go, and by that I mean they go after they defend the Outlaw Tech's base from an Authority scout that happens upon them and everyone has to escape. They're able to make it to their destination, find the operative, his name is Reckon, and then they're able to extract him along with his colleagues. One of those colleagues is our alien sidekick, Atuari. And they would have been able to make their escape scot-free if not for one of Reckon's other colleagues turning traitor. Said escape turns into a shootout or three. At one point, this is described as red beams of annihilation bickering back and forth, and when I read that line, I genuinely loved it. Anyway, in order for everyone to escape, Chewbacca sacrifices himself and is captured by the Authority. That means that the job kind of changes for Han. He needs to rescue Chewie. Thankfully, that's doable because the information Reckon had retrieved was related to where political prisoners are sent in the Authority. Han, Atuari, and the droids travel to this high-security prison facility. That would be the titular Star's End. They infiltrate it by pretending to be a visiting theater troupe there for the entertainment of the nasty Authority officer in charge. Everything is resolved by Han in explosive fashion, and I mean that quite literally. He explodes the sealed, secured, and shielded facility, launching it into the upper atmosphere, at which point he stages a prisoner's rebellion. Everyone who deserves to be rescued is. Han has Chewie back, Atuari has her mate, Doc is reunited with Jessa, and yes, Han is given the needed waiver to help with his next adventure. I told you Han was the man of the hour. He is pure pulp science fiction hero here. He can talk his way out of almost anything, or failing that, logic his way out, or just flat out engineer his escape. And oh, there are so many scrapes for him to find his way out of, besides the ones I've already mentioned. As an overview just of Star's End, some of these scrapes include dealing weapons to insurgents, paying off and then outsmarting a crime boss he's fallen on the wrong side of, getting the Falcon out of impoundment. As a side note, this is one of my favorite performances of the story, with Chewbacca pretending to be drunk while Han pickpockets a security officer. Going head-to-head with a squadron of fighters, Han is flying everyone's favorite pre-Imperial snub fighter, the Z-95 Headhunter. He solves a murder, and then of course there's rescuing Chewie, reuniting various side characters with their loved ones, and freeing all the prisoners. And of course all the firefights, fistfights, and battles of wit requisite to these various situations. He thinks on his feet, outsmarts his opponents, and evens the odds. He always plays the hand he's dealt, just creatively. But that's not where the character ends. We have some solid hints at what motivates Han. For instance, we're told many times that Han is an exceptional pilot, but we're also shown that his skill comes from his love. He loves to be in a good ship out amongst the stars. Then we have another rather telling part of Han's personality. He tells any and everyone who will listen that he only cares about himself, that he's just doing what he has to make a quick buck and keep his freedom. But his actions frequently undermine that. The very first job we see Han complete is running weapons. He delivers them to some freedom fighters who are obviously woefully ill-equipped to go against the Authority. What he should do is just make the delivery and go. But he can't help taking a few minutes to give them a couple of pointers and some tactics in hopes that it'll save a few lives. I mean, you could argue that Chewbacca prompts this particular instance of do-gooding, but there's a reason why the two of them are partners. And speaking of Chewbacca, at the end of the story, Han switches from trying to rescue just Chewie to a full-scale liberation of political prisoners. He cannot see a need and just ignore it. This all seems very consistent to what we've seen of Han on screen at this point. A couple years out from this story, he's going to be flying back to the Death Star, taking that shot at Vader, and saving Luke. Somehow, it all makes sense. That said, it is a matter of diminishing returns. By the time we get to Han Solo and the Lost Legacy, his character is still consistent, but we're done with those little flashes of insight and, dare I say, depth that we find in Star's End. No one and nothing else shines quite so brightly as Han. I'll talk a little bit more about Chewbacca later on, but here he's generally confined to his usual nonverbal support role. There's a couple of great scenes that really show how he and Han work together as a team, but then partway through the story, he disappears. This is something of a trend in Star's End. For instance, early on, we're introduced to Han's shady, sometimes employer, Pluvo 2-for-1. Is he going to become an important antagonist? No. Then comes the girl, Jessa. She's really just there to set Han off on the job that's the catalyst for the bulk of the story, and then come back for the final scene so she and Han can walk off into the sunset. After that, we have Reckon, the one-time professor who has been working to uncover how and where the Authority disappears its dissidents to. Reckon, we think, is going to stick around. Well, we get 2 chapters of him engaging Han in soul-bearing debate before he's, spoiler, murdered. I was actually a little bit annoyed at that one. I mean, from a story perspective, it adds an additional little plot twist and it gives Han the opportunity to be clever, but it just didn't seem necessary. As a little side note here, during one of their chats, Han tells Reckon specifically that he likes to shoot first. It's an actual line of Han's dialogue years before the special edition made everyone start wearing Han shot first shirts. That said, Han didn't manage to shoot the murderer first, but, you can't win them all. Atuari is also more plot device than person. Like I said, she's our alien sidekick. In this case, she's Triani, which, if this was a Star Trek universe, we would probably call Cation, and I mentally referred to her as the cat lady for most of the story. She's also kind of a 2-for-1 deal because we also have her mute cub Pakka along for the ride. Now, she has a good reason to help Han, and she has some interesting skill sets. She's a military ranger. That said, the skill that she's able to use in helping to infiltrate Star's End is actually in the traditional dances of her people. Oh, and speaking of that infiltration, Atuari does get a blink and you'll miss it scene that I particularly enjoyed. At the last moment, she goes from telling Han that she will not pretend to be a traveling performer to a split second later turning full impresario the moment she needs to be in character. It was fun, and I suppose it gives us a little flash of insight into her character. She's able to roll with the punches and keep up with Han's cons. That brings us to our droid duo, and what could be more classic Star Wars than that? Because of the disparity in their relative ages, Bullux and Blue Max have more of a mentor-mentee setup that eventually morphs into a symbiotic counterpartship. It's quite different from, say, C-3PO and R2-D2, or most of the other droid pairs I can think of off the top of my head. It also lacks that element of friendly antagonism that seems so common with droids. I like the fact that both droids are verbal. It makes it easy for them to participate in the story without too much maneuvering that would probably be out of place in a book like this. Blue Max is just okay. His personality is pretty much gee whiz, genius child, and it can be a bit much, though he's by no means superfluous. The first part of the job in Star's End hinges on him, and he makes himself useful throughout the series. He does also pick up the habit of profanity from Han, a little bit to Han's chagrin. But I was glad that much of the focus was on Bullux, and yes, everybody in story is aware of how ridiculous his name is. He's comparatively old. We're told that he has this slow way of walking and ponderous way of speaking, and that he's very aware of his own mortality. After he outlasted his first function, what he was originally designed to do, he spent his life avoiding obsolescence, droid death as he calls it. He's taken whatever upgrades, training, programming he can so that he can continue to work. He doesn't care if the task is humble, he just wants to be able to continue on. It's hard not to root for him. Interestingly enough, we spend some time in Bullux's head near the end of the story, and he tells us one of the reasons he's managed to survive for so long. To quote, Bullux employed a trick that he had learned from one of his first human owners, and simply omitted from computations the logical conclusion that his destruction was now a high order of probability. Amongst humans, he knew this tactic was called ignoring certain death. Bullux thought of it as excluding counterproductive data. He'd been doing it for a long time now, which was why he was still functional. Yeah, somehow, Han ended up with a droid who doesn't want to talk about the odds. As I said, the droids are the only characters that will stay with us throughout the trilogy. Well, let's go ahead and go on to our next story, Han Solo's Revenge. This is my personal favorite, though it has its fair share of absurdity. As I mentioned, I think of this as the plot story. It might be more accurate to call it the series of coincidences story. Unlike Star's End's habit of introducing characters and events and then promptly discarding them, Revenge is more a matter of, hey, remember that guy I mentioned in Act 1? He's going to show up in Act 2. Remember that guy that dies in the opening conflict? He's going to be important later on. Remember that guy who's had a few random mentions throughout the story? Yeah, it turns out he's been around the entire time. Remember that technical issue the Falcon's been having? It's going to come into play twice. The job here is a little vague. We open with Han and Chewie, and Bullocks and Blue Max for good measure, unknowingly working with slavers. This crosses so many lines for our heroes, and while the slaves end up freed and the slavers creatively dispatched, Han feels that he's been cheated out of his payday. He finds some information on the slaver's apparent employer, and he decides to try to track him down and claim his money. Instead, he runs into an authority auditor, Fiola, who's working to bring down the slavery ring. She's our girl. She's pretty sure that the slavery ring is a sign of corruption within the authority, and this is the first time we're introduced to the name Ottoman. He's Fiola's boss's etc. boss, and we're not sure if he's a good guy or a bad guy. What we do know is that Fiola is willing to take her case as far as she needs to for justice to prevail, and to make a name for herself. Fiola's a pretty great character. In my opinion, she is the best of the girls, and her introduction is a fun series of scenes with hidden and mistaken identities, a knife fight, a swoop chase. Fiola ends by kind of coercing Han into helping her, and he agrees in return for A, not having the Falcon impounded by a collections agent that's caught up with him, and B, obviously getting his revenge on the slavers. And by revenge, I mean his money. That's the job, such as it is. Here, the story takes a little bit of a different track than its predecessor, as Han and Fiola team up for the A storyline, and Chewie ends up with the collections agent, this little otter-like alien named Spray, and they have a relatively substantial B story. Both groups are trying to get to the same destination, the planet Ammon, undetected. Han and Fiola make their way off planet by way of a fancy pleasure cruiser that's attacked by the slavers. I knew something was going to go wrong the moment Fiola showed up in a floor-length evening gown. It lasted for a couple of scenes before the skirt got torn off, as you might expect. Chewie, the droids, and Spray, on the other hand, continue to their destination on the Falcon. They make a crash landing thanks to sabotage, with the droids in an escape pod, and Chewie and Spray stranded with the Falcon on a mountain range, and we get to watch them bond a little bit. There's a couple just oddball scenes with them. One story beat involves Chewbacca building a hang glider out of a tripod and an animal carcass. It's really somewhat gruesome if you follow all the technical details that the author includes about its construction. Han and Fiola, meanwhile, also make it to their final destination by stealing one of the slavers' own shuttles. Ammon, as it turns out, has a generically exotic culture, and we find that Fiola's lead there is embroiled in an honor duel to the death that he really doesn't want to be participating in. They cut a deal, and Han, against his will, takes the man's place and prepares to face off against the feared gunman Galandro. Galandro bows out of the duel because, well, apparently he's working for the good guys? Now, we don't know that yet, but that's what's going on. Fiola is able to get the information she needs to build her case, everyone's reunited, and then the Falcon is attacked by slavers, but then saved by the Authority security police. Who would have thought we would be happy to see them show up? That's when we find out that pretty much everything that has happened to Han after his job with the slavers went awry has been part of a plot by Ottoman, who is not corrupt, but has been working behind the scenes to destroy the slavers. And guess what? We've already met him. Our mastermind this entire time has been Spray, who hides his identity to circumvent the non-human prejudice that is apparently something the Empire and the corporate sector authority have in common. From now on, he and Fiola will be able to work together to bring peace and justice to the galaxy. Unfortunately, he also wants to arrest Han, even though he's been a big help here. Because, well, Spray just can't ignore the fact that Han has also skirted the law more than once. In a last daring escape, Han and Chewbacca take Spray hostage, ransom him for the money they've been trying to get since Chapter 1, and head off into the sunset, away from the Authority. It is bonkers and delightful. I think the story works for a couple of reasons. One, because all of the heavy lifting done with Han's character in Star's End. This is where the fact that these books are technically a trilogy comes in handy. Han is free to be charming and charismatic here because we learned a mere 100 pages or so ago that he has some real depth beyond that. 2, because there was clearly an effort to keep the bonkers plot consistent and logical. Ultimately, all three stories are extremely straightforward, and they have a hefty dose of comedic vignettes. At the same time, virtually every scene is a stepping stone that leads somewhere, which in turn leads somewhere else. I'm not going to call the plots complex, but perhaps dense is a fitting description. It's almost mind-boggling to realize how much movement happens in what would have originally been little 200-page pocket paperbacks. That showcases a fair amount of technical skill, and it's at its most obvious in Han Solo's Revenge. And finally, the supporting characters are much stronger here than in either of the other stories. Fiola and Spray/Ottoman could both be transported comfortably into a later, more nuanced EU novel. It's perhaps telling that Lordians, Fiola's culture, have made it into the canon, albeit somewhat changed. They're still the masters of body language and subtle communication, traits introduced through Fiola. Chewbacca also comes out ahead in this story. Like I said, we actually have some scenes from his point of view. They may not be brilliant or particularly insightful scenes, but they do establish that Chewbacca is not merely clever, he's analytical, and that he is more than capable on his own. These are good additions to have to his character. As a final note, Han Solo's Revenge sneaks in a few more ties to the greater galaxy. Early on, we get a mention that not everyone is happy with the rigid restrictions that were imposed after the Clone Wars. Truer words have never been spoken, although in story, the implication is that even the Empire would balk at rampant slavery, which, well, that was very optimistic of the author. This brings us to our final story, Han Solo and the Lost Legacy. I have a confession to make. By the time I got to the final installment of this trilogy, I was a little burned out. The Lost Legacy does wrap up what few threads of plot carried throughout the trilogy. I just couldn't bring myself to care that much. The story itself is helped by the fact that it is a straightforward treasure hunt, complete with ancient map that needs to be recovered and rival treasure hunters. After the pileup of contrivance and coincidence that was Han Solo's Revenge, regardless of how much I enjoyed that, it was probably a smart move to strip back to the basics. There was even an effort to kind of tie the trilogy together. Way back in Star's End, there's this throwaway reference to the fabled ship, the Queen of Ranroon. Well, that's basically what we're after in this story. We learn all about Zim the Despot, who ruled this part of the galaxy in the days before the Republic. He conquered with the help of his army of killer robots, but fell into obscurity after his flagship, the said Queen of Ranroon, disappeared. The Queen of Ranroon, however, was filled with treasure. That treasure has to be somewhere, right? Han and Chewbacca are pulled into the search when they run into an old friend, Bedur. Bedur has this pseudo-adopted daughter, Hasti, whose deceased twin sister found a log recorder disc from the Queen of Ranroon. That's essentially our treasure map. The disc is in a safety deposit box on the planet Daley, which, conveniently, is also the planet the treasure is supposed to be on. Han isn't too sure that he wants to go chasing after fables, but apparently Bedur once saved Han and Chewie's lives, and we all know how seriously Wookiees take their life debts. So off they go to Daley with Bedur, Hasti, and our alien sidekick. In this case, Skinks, a professor specializing in Zim's time period who desperately wants to have a good old human-style adventure before he's going to have to build his chrysalis and metamorphose into a giant dumb butterfly at some point. So, adventure first. We spend more time on Daley than any other location in the trilogy, which is why I call this the setting story. Though, really, we bounce around just as much as we did when we were planet hopping, and we don't always get a particularly strong sense of place. Still, we get a little bit of background thanks to Hasti. She and her sister both worked for a shady mining operation on the planet for several years. This is also where they cross paths with Bedur. In the parlance of newer Star Wars media, it is a backwater scughole. Like Ammon before it, I'm going to classify the primary human settlement, besides the mining operation, as generically exotic. Han and company use this to their advantage, staging a distraction of bad faith haggling with some locals so that Hasty can slip away to the bank and retrieve the disc. Sadly, this doesn't really amount to anything, because while Hasty may look like her twin sister, she apparently doesn't sound enough like her for the voice recognition security system. Our heroes don't have a chance to come up with an alternate plan, however, because now the owners of the mining operation decide to drop by. They somehow know that Hasty is back on the planet to retrieve the disc, and they want it for themselves. To be honest, I'm not sure if this is really explained in the novel how they know that, or if, because I was a little bored, I just skimmed over it. Anyway, a firefight breaks out, and while everyone escapes, the Falcon is left behind. You can imagine how Han feels about this. So getting the Falcon back becomes Han's top priority. In order to do that, they're going to need to go on a little trip to get to the miners' camp. First step, Han and his friends need to cross a giant lake. Well, how do they do this? It turns out that the native inhabitants of Daley are giant, semi-aquatic dinosaurs who run a ferry service. It just so happens that there's a power struggle going on between the old top dog and his younger nephew, so our heroes get a free ferry ride. Unfortunately, that ferry ride also involves a battle for dominance and territory out on the lake. Yeah, everyone gets really wet. Incidentally, it's during this altercation that Han is noted as getting a knife cut to the chin, and once they get to shore, there's no time to properly treat it. So Han's scar origin story? It involves dinosaurs. Now that they've crossed the lake, they're going to be going on quite a hike to get to the miners' settlement. And this impromptu hiking trip gives Hasty a chance to warm up to Han, and we also get a little background of Han in the Imperial Academy. Bador was one of his sergeants. Their trek comes to an unexpected end when they're captured by an isolated tribe of humans who intend to offer them as sacrifices. It occurs to me that if you count Han Solo Adventures as one book, that means that the early expanded universe is 2 for 2 for having our heroes captured and threatened with human sacrifice. And you know what? We haven't even gotten to Endor and the Ewoks yet. I think I need to start keeping a running tally of this. Turns out these humans are the descendants of the crew of the Queen of Ranroon, and they make for our 4th distinctive group that we've dealt with on Daley. This group, the Survivors, have been guarding the treasure and maintaining a detachment of Zem's killer robots for the last, 2,000 odd years. Everything comes to a head when said killer robots are released. Everyone converges at the mining facilities, and remember the feared gunman Galandro from Han Solo's Revenge? Yeah, he shows up. He wants to kill Han for being such an insulting nerf herder, but he's willing to temporarily team up with him because, killer robots and treasure. Bullocks and Blue Max get their moment of glory when they sorrowfully thwart the killer robots, but only after said army of robots has conveniently dispatched our heroes' enemies, of course. Galandro stops pretending to be on Han's side once they find the treasure vaults. They end up having a quick-draw showdown, and Galandro wins when he shoots Han in the shoulder. He intends to drag Han back to the corporate sector authority and make him suffer. Galandro's revenge is short-lived, however. At this point in the narrative, we've been reminded several times that the treasure vaults have an anti-weapon security system. So Skinks lures Galandro across the threshold and, he's fried on the spot. Now there's nothing standing between our heroes and the treasure. So why is it that Han and Chewie end up on Tatooine a few short months later looking for work, instead of enjoying their newfound riches? Well, because it turns out that a treasure 2,000 years ago isn't worth much in this galaxy. Skinks, the academic, is ecstatic. He is definitely getting his own department at the university, and he has research materials to last a lifetime, or again, until he transforms into a butterfly. Bador, Hasty, and yes, Bullocks and Blue Max all agree to go work for him. On the other hand, Han and Chewie scrape together just enough to have the Falcon repaired, Han's shoulder healed, and then they head off on their next adventure. In my opinion, The Lost Legacy shares most of the weak points of both of the previous stories, and few of their strengths. Han doesn't have any real place to shine. We're long past getting any kind of meaningful insight into him, even though this story technically reveals more of his background as an Imperial cadet. Chewbacca's big moment of the story is probably right at the beginning, when he picks up two college girls who want to learn how to speak Wookiee. But instead of being able to take them out on a romantic double date, he and Han end up in a high-speed chase driving what's essentially a gaudy red limo that Chewie has rented, so it doesn't end particularly well for anyone. Our side characters here are fine. Again, for me, they suffer a little bit in comparison to their immediate predecessors. Bullocks and Blue Max do get their final act of heroism in by engineering the defeat of the war robots, all while grappling with the morality of destroying their fellow droids. And our plot really pulls out the pulp science fiction conventions with the army of killer robots, the booby-trapped treasure vaults, and there's even a little bit of mind control going on with the survivors. It was fine. Maybe it was even okay. I just was ready to move on to a different story at this point. The trilogy ends this way. "Look," Han said, "that's it for missions of mercy, all right? We're smugglers, and that's what we know, and that's what we're good at, and that's what we're sticking to." The Wookiee growled concurrence. The others, surrounded by the endless shelf stacks of Zim's treasure, heard the discussion echo back from the corridor. Han broke into Chewbacca's rumblings with, "When the Falcon's repaired and this wing of mine's fixed, we're going to try another Kessel Spice run." The Wookiee croaked an irritated objection. Han insisted, "It's fast money, and we won't have to look at any dirt. We'll get Jabba the Hutt or someone to back us for a cut. Listen, I've got this plan." Just as they were moving out of earshot, Chewbacca's protest stopped. He and Han Solo shared some joke that made both laugh slyly. Then they returned to their schemes. "There," Bedour declared to Hasty, Skinks, Bullocks, and Blue Max, "go the real survivors." So, are the Han Solo adventures worth reading? I'm going to say yes, if you like this kind of light Saturday matinee serial science fiction. There's so much of the Han Solo adventures that doesn't neatly fall into a good or bad category, but I like it for what it is. I also feel safe in assuming that the Han Solo adventures are not the definitive entry in Han's Legends career. I think the later Han Solo trilogy does touch on some of the events here, but ultimately, these are very much standalone stories. I enjoyed them, but if pulpy adventure stories aren't your favorite, you can probably skip these without losing any real insight into the Legends continuity. Still, I was sad to learn that Brian Daley passed away quite young in 1997, while the EU was still in the early days of its revitalization. Outside of Star Wars, he collaborated frequently with James Lucero, who has since written many Legends and canon novels. I wish we had had the opportunity to see that team at work in the expanded universe. I really think Mr. Daley brought something to these silly little pulp novels, and I would have liked to see what he might have done in the larger universe without the early restrictions on content. In the first chapter of Han Solo at Star's End, we're told Han Solo and Chewbacca the Wookiee had their money, their freedom, and for a wonder their lives. And that, Han thought, should be enough for anyone, shouldn't it? It's enough for me. I'm giving the Han Solo Adventures as a collection 2.5 stars, the same rating that I gave Splinter of the Mind's Eye. The fact of the matter is, the Han Solo Adventures are infinitely more fun than their predecessor, but they also don't hold quite the same historical interest as the first novel of the EU. I'd say read them if you're stranded in an airport waiting for your next adventure to begin. Friends, I know this episode was a little bit chaotic, so thank you for sticking with me this far. In our next episode, we'll be meeting up with our other favorite rogue in the adventures of Lando Calrissian. Until then, this is Rin signing off from Coruscant. May the Force be with you.